Can you hear us?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Excellent. Yeah. We can hear you. Graham was asked to go first, so I'll ask Graham to start. Up to you. Okay. Welcome, everybody. This is the session on the economic future, and I feel completely out of my depth, but that's all right because we have the very great fortune to have two people who really know what they're talking about. We have Graham Bishop and Professor Rosa Lastra. And when I was preparing the notes, which you'll find, by the way, if you haven't picked them up, they're at the back as a list of all the speakers. I found that they were both consulted extensively by all sorts of committees, European and British, and indeed it was impossible for me to list them all. The page would have been full. So I feel we're very lucky today that we're able to consult them. They're going to straighten this out. And I will ask Graham to start first and tell us about the economic future leading up to 2033.
Yes, well, I've been given the title of It's the Economy, Stupid. I don't know whether that's me stupid or you, I can't tell. Maybe it was the author of the title. So if I could have my first slide. Right, and then we can go to the second one.
Too many controls.
So, excellent. So that's the starting slide. Now we go to the. Oh.
Is the second slide?
Yes.
That's the second slide.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Sorry. Yes. Yes. Right. So just to give you the flavour of what I'm going to talk about, so you can see how this is going to develop in the next 10 minutes or slightly more, hopefully. So you can go to the next slide, Ulrika. First thing I want to talk about is how big the European Union might be in 10 years' time. Now, this is assuming all the countries who are applicants in one form or another on the list or approaching the list, etc. At the end of this 10-year period, they all become members. And what you see immediately, just looking at the populations, is the sheer scale of the European Union already. If you add in all those small applicants, none of which amount to very much in terms of population except Serbia, which has very specific problems. If you add them in, and the Ukraine, which my IMF data puts a population of 33 million, it may be more, it may be less, it's difficult to tell at the moment, but you get up to a potential total population of the EU in 10 years' time of 500 million. Which is very substantially above that of the US at 335. Now, I have put there Turkey as a memo item. Turkey, as you see, is population of 86 million, compares with Germany's 84. So if Turkey were to join, they would be the single largest number of members of the European Parliament, and therefore a very significant part of the co-legislature. Will the population of Europe, the EU, vote for that? I'll leave you to contemplate it. Anyway, let's then go to the GDP and think about that. We have already the EU 27, these are in dollars actually, because that's what the IMF provides, still work in dollars. They'll learn soon. So about 17 trillion for the EU as a whole. The GDPs of all the small applicants in Ukraine put together are frankly a sort of a rounding error. Now, that may be the case now, or in 10 years' time, but in 20 years' time, a couple of years, a few years of membership of the EU, and we begin to see the same dynamic as happened during the accession of the Eastern European countries. They have a very rapid growth. So there could be an extremely rapid growth potential coming from admitting these new members. Again, I've put there Turkey, not a very large country, but quite significant. The salient point here is that the US, despite it being significantly smaller in population, has a much bigger GDP, even when you've taken in all these other countries. So when you're talking about the relative economic power, the US still remains the preeminent power. I should just say, we've talked quite a bit about Russia earlier on. The Russian population is around about 120, 140 million. Numbers vary. So that's a quarter of the EU, which we might have in 10 years' time. And that's why Russia has a real problem with Western Europe. They are very small and a very large country, of course, very big area. They're a very small population compared to the whole of the totality of Europe. And if you talk about GDP, I haven't looked up Russian GDP. The numbers are really worth thinking about. But the EU's GDP will be 10 times that of Russia. So the ability to maintain this war footing for years on end strongly favors the EU's industrial power to produce more munitions and against the small Russian economy. So if I can move on to the next. Now, the role of the euro. David said in his comments, I noted, talked about the Monnet principle of have a small, narrow, joint policy on one area and then widen it. The euro is that area. There are others, but the euro is certainly one of those which spills over and widens dramatically. And I hope I will demonstrate that in the next few minutes. Internationally, the euro still lags a long way behind the power of the US dollar. If you're talking about bond issues, the dollar is 3 times the proportion of the EU. Very interestingly, recently, the currency development, I looked at the ECB's data on this, and I was really surprised to see the sudden fall off in the last couple of years of the role of the dollar. One might say a lot of countries have suddenly realized that holding dollars puts them in the power of the American judicial, regulatory, political system. So they may be less willing. Anyway, there may be something there which comes up over the years to come. The other point about the international markets, if you're looking at government bonds, which are the benchmark for bond markets, the American government bond market is about 20 trillion. We only talk about trillions nowadays in modern finance, versus the European is about 10. But most importantly, when you're looking at the benchmark of liquidity in international markets, which is so dominant, the European, or the euro area to be more precise, short-term bills, very short-term, 1-year bills, is about 600 billion, 0.6 of a billion. The American is 5 trillion, so 10 times that. That's one of the reasons why the dollar has such a lock on the global financial system. That's one of the problems which the EU has to address. Now, the other problem that the EU has is that there's a much greater bank intermediation of the economy, of the financial system, than there is in the US. Let's just switch now to Europe and look at the scale of the banking assets. They're about 40 trillion, so that's 3 times GDP. And that is financed with about 18 trillion of deposits. And the other is bonds and equity and so on. But the deposit base is therefore at 18 trillion, is about not far off twice the size of the government bond market. So when you're talking about banking union, which people talk about greatly, you're actually talking about European Deposit Insurance Scheme, EDIS to its friends, would finish up having an exposure, if it were to guarantee all the bank deposits, all the retail deposits in the EU and the Eurozone, it would be twice the size of the obligation to the government if you mutualize government bonds. This is why Germany, with a GDP of 3 trillion, is a bit hesitant, to say the least, about undertaking the role of guarantor to all these financial assets. So this is a fundamental problem, and I can easily understand the Germans' reticence in it. So that's probably all I want to say on the size of capital markets and so on. Let's move on now to, we know how big the euro is and how small it is relative to the dollar markets. How do you join it? will these new countries I've talked about, will they want to join the euro? Well, one thing we should be very clear about, once you've become a member of the euro, and I was on the committee which designed the changeover, and we very deliberately insisted on removing all the old notes and coins and replacing them with a single new set, because in practice, that makes it virtually impossible to leave the euro. I could enlarge on that. And of course, if you the only way you can leave the euro is to leave the EU. And then you've done Brexit and so on. You'll never remember. So when Brendan, I think, talked about the ratchet effect, there is an example of the ratchet effect. Joining the euro is a one-way trip. Now, how do you do that? It's very noticeable that many of the countries, the new countries, Eastern European countries, many of them, starting right up to Russia, immediately they joined the European Union, directed their policies to join the euro. And they did that because the euro is a core policy of the EU. Therefore, the more you become part of the core policies, the more you're integrated into Europe and defended against the Russian influence. Not all of them have done that, as we know. There are a number who haven't. Bulgaria, Czech, Hungary, Romania, and Poland. Now, and Sweden, I'm going to talk about. Croatia, of course, a new country in the EU, and immediately joined the euro at the beginning of this year. Now, I've read a number of commentaries about how you could fudge this question of euro membership. I don't think that's possible for a new member. We were really thinking about the UK joining the EU. Would it have to join the euro? Every 2 years, the ECB is mandated to write a convergence, and the Commission is mandated to write a convergence report on all the countries who are not part of the euro, and yet they all signed a treaty which committed them to joining it when they could. And that report is a mere 200 pages, so I didn't read all of it immediately, but it's a very detailed review of the performance. There's no ifs and buts and woolly statements. The ECB goes through it, boom, 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 boom. And what it looks at is the deficit, we all know the 3%, the debt ratios approaching 60%, GDP, inflation, currency stability, that means joining the ERM2, long-term interest rates, central bank legislation, and critically, sustainable convergence. So you may have converged on all those numbers. Can you sustain it? Do you have a set of legislative instruments and a legislature who is committed to sustaining that? This is an interesting question for Poland after the election. Will we now see the largest non-member of the euro begin to change its attitude and start trying to shape all aspects of policy with a view to joining the euro? I posed the question. I'm not going to try and answer it this year, but maybe shortly. So that's how to join the euro. Now, my next point is about the necessity of the single market in money and finance. Now, since the Conservative UK Commissioner Lord Cockfield, everyone here will probably remember him, proposed the single market in 1985, I think. Everyone has taken it for granted that was the basic achievement of the single market in 1992, was the biggest triumph of Mrs. Thatcher's European policy. There are lots of ironies here. Now, if you're going to have a barrier-free market, then for 500 million people, in due course, end of the 10 years, so that we can compete industrially with China, with America, etc., then that was nothing more than one of the founding visions of Winston Churchill. His great speeches in the 1940s after the Second World War stated very clear this barrier-free market right the way across Europe should be part of the vision. The single market creates it. Now, once the customs union had been achieved en route to the single market, it became clear that it wouldn't survive competitive devaluations. Go back to the 1980s, the snake and all these other things, trying to keep European currencies together, and they moved apart. So the competitive devaluations were a complete threat to the existence of the single market, continuation of it. And that was the genesis of having the euro. That's where it came from. Now, once you've stopped competitive devaluations, then perhaps you should move to stopping competitive financial services, which offer cut rate bank loans by giving riskier, allowing banks to be riskier and boosting your economy at the expense of your rivals who aren't so risk-based. That's all very well, but you then finish up with a set of risky banks. And when they fail, which history has told us repeatedly, recently they do fail, who bails them out? Who bails out the depositors? Go back to that question of 18 trillion of bank deposits in the EU. The answer came after the great financial crash of 2007-8, with a complete reshaping and revision of the entire financial services legislation, which is still ongoing. And that, just read the speech by von der Leyen. She hopes to finish the 20-odd pieces of legislation in this parliament, the latest 20-odd pieces. This is a massive integrative driving force, make no mistake about it. And it's a massive soft power. The more the euro becomes a global currency, it's a massive soft power. Now, I'm going to close. I see I'm being warned. I'm going to close by just commenting about the greening of the EU economy. There's a greening section later on. The EU's role in taking a leading dynamic role in this is very noteworthy. The EU began to develop a plan to do this in 2018, and the Ursula von der Leyen Commission has taken that forward. The EU has set about a very root and branch, thorough process of saying, right, the companies are going to have to report their sustainability footprint. The investors and the banks who invest in the equities or buy the bonds or lend, they've all got to take account of their lending to these companies. Is it green lending or not? And so the idea is from both sides to put the squeeze on the supply of finance to non-green, shall I say, activities, or to encourage green activities. Very sound approach. 2 weeks ago, Commissioner McGuinness told the European Parliament, right, you have now just passed the green bond standard. That completes our green bond, our green agenda, legislative agenda. What next? Now, as a sideline for Brexit, the UK is in the process. We said we're going to be a global leader in green finance. Next year, we hope to have a consultation on it. The EU has done it and put it into practice. So, with that, thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Greg. And Professor Lastra, are you still with us?
Yes, I'm still with you, and as always, listening very attentively to my good friend and colleague Graham, who has always did a great job in forecasting how big the EU will be in 2023 and some lessons thereof, particularly with regard to the role of the euro. Absent a crystal ball into the future, I'll just make a few further reflections about the present and the lessons of the past in order to guide us into the future. Brendan, you asked me to commence with some introductory remarks. Is the economy stupid was a successful slogan coined by Bill Clinton's campaign advisor, if I recall his name, I think it was James Carville, in 1992 in his successful run against Bush for the White House. And I lived in the US at the time, so I remember it well. I was actually working at that time at the IMF in conditions which were much more optimistic than the world has at the moment. And as successful and as simplistic a slogan, a bit like the Brexit one, even if misguided, this can be very can actually be a change in the fortune of a country. So let me link the economy to the broader institutional and historical framework. First, I wanted to recall the famous Schuman Declaration in 1950 that was at the origin of the European coal and steel community, and of course, eventually of the EEC. And as we all know, he said, Europe will not be made all at once or according to a single plan. It will be built through concrete achievements which first create a de facto solidarity. And then he continues to say that it also will eliminate the age-old opposition of France and Germany, very much of a 1950s mentality. So my first reflection is, an introductory remark is, do not underestimate the EU. The EU has been at crossroads through the different stages of its history, facing the economic and political challenges of the time, and also the different views that the EU citizens across the member states have on how far integration should go or not go. And this is, of course, at the root of something which is part of what you do, the federalist and quasi-federalist structures of political systems in which centripetal and centrifugal forces push, in this case, the European project in different directions. Though these days I hold a dual British and Spanish citizenship, which gives me many advantages when I travel, Spain itself is the subject of these centripetal and centrifugal forces with the so-called Estado de las Autonomías, which is not a pure federal state, and because of not being a pure federal state, is suffering all sorts of continuous crises, mostly in Catalonia, but also in the Basque Country. But coming back to the EU, as we all know, started as a trade integration project with institutions that were suitable for a trade agreement, but not for a political union. However, as the community turned into a union, the institutions have shown their deficiencies. We do have a powerful judicial authority, which has been the subject of much criticism in the country that we live, the Court of Justice of the European Union, a formidable court. And we have, as Graham reminded us, a very powerful monetary authority, a monetary executive in the hands of the European Central Bank. But we do not have a proper parliament, and that obviously is a major constraint, since we do not have a single fiscal policy, and we do not have, of course, a Euro treasury. My guess is that the institutional framework will be revised in future, will continue to be adjusted to the new reality. However, a caveat, any revision requires a treaty change, and we all know the treaty changes are opening Pandora's box. Coming back to the economy, so moving from the institutional and historical reflections of what was a trade agreement to the reality of what Europe is now, a fundamental issue for the EU economy now comes from the challenges of deepening on the one hand versus widening on the other, something which is not new. Graham very well talked, as he always does, about what the next candidates for EU membership will be in the Balkans, Albania, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Georgia, Kosovo, Moldova, Montenegro, North Macedonia and Serbia, and far more important, if or when Ukraine on the one hand and Turkey on the other hand joins, the EU will face not only the economic cost of making the four freedoms a reality, in particular the free movement of people, which obviously was at the core of the Brexit campaign, because the other three freedoms only became far more controversial after the Brexit campaign, not before. But we will have the cost of also integration, as the unification of Eastern and West Germany evidence. One should never underestimate the massive cost for the EU does, and the forces that it triggers. After all, it was the extension to Eastern Europe in 2004 and the position that the UK government took that put the seeds for what eventually became a much greater anti-EU stance that there was perhaps in the past. But besides the widening, we have the deepening. And again, here I'm going to pick some of the threads that Graham already talked about banking union, capital markets union, and fiscal union. EMU, as we all know, economic and monetary union, is a misnomer. We often refer as EMU as European Monetary Union, but as also Graham knows well, it was conceived originally as the acronym for Economic and Monetary Union. But we have only monetary union, very powerful monetary union, if I may say, because we have many aspects of monetary sovereignty that have been transferred, not just monetary policy and note issue, but the supervision and regulation of the payment system and now prudential financial institutions, significant credit institutions. And since the EU minus UK, which is no longer part of the EU, is much more bank dominated, this of course is very significant. But we do not have economic union, nor are we likely to have it. I don't know if in 2033, I wish I had had the crystal ball, but we will have, that I predict, greater economic policy coordination, both positive and negative. Positive in terms of rules that bring us together, and negative in terms of prohibitions, further prohibitions. So we will have, for instance, continued greater coordination, and actually I would say judicial and DG Comp activism in the way that big tech companies are dealt with through competition rules and the way that they affect the single market. And we will have greater coordination in other areas. We will not have, I think, in the foreseeable future, but we may have perhaps in 2033. So let's divide the short term from the long term. As Keynes would say, in the long run, we are all dead. But in the medium term, we may advance towards, I should say, greater, and I will explain why, greater fiscal, almost union, let's call it quasi-union. Let's play with the terminology of sometimes the federal states or quasi-federal states or quasi-estado de las autonomías like in Spain. Because, for instance, I cannot see how we can continue post-Ukraine not to have further coordination when it comes to defense. So we will need to continue to develop mechanisms that make the aspects of fiscal union a reality. After all, we can have full fiscal union or elements of fiscal union. I'll talk to, if I have time, about next gen in a few minutes. But let me just say a few things. So as I said, competition, I expect an aggressive competition stance by DG Comp, as well as judicial activism. In financial markets, when we will have the completion of banking union, just to remind our audience, we have single supervision and single resolution, but we do not have single deposit insurance, which creates many frictions in the European Union, since a euro deposit should be the same in any member state, and it is not at the moment, even though deposits are the largest part of the money supply. And this, of course, has also implications. Banking union has, in my opinion, great implications for the adoption of the digital euro. Just to remind our audience that the Commission came up with a very extensive legislative package in the summer on the adoption of the digital euro with a timetable and everything. You know, one thing I always criticize is the formidable legislative machine that the EU creates. Once that you start putting something in process, it almost has a cadence and a sequence of its own. But we have a digital euro that building up on what Graham says, it's true that we have de facto still a global quasi-monopoly as a global currency of the US dollar. There is no doubt that the weaponization of money and payments, both with the sanctions on the central bank reserves and the Euroclear halting of the payment orders, is creating incentive for other jurisdictions around the world, including the EU, to develop a parallel, well, not a parallel payment system, because the EU very much relies on Euroclear, but certainly parallel currencies. And other countries, and we're not talking today about other currencies, but obviously they're looking at this very carefully. But leaving aside the weaponization of money and finance, the implications for a digital euro, which I think is behind some of the, you can read it in some of the introductory remarks to the legislation, is to make the euro really the powerful currency that it should be in the digital area. So there is no doubt that the euro wants to play a bigger role, and with the numbers that Graham gave us, we can see why. The capital markets union is the big, after all, the capital markets union as the single market were, UK projects. The single market, you're right to always recall Margaret Thatcher and Lord Cockfield, which came with a white paper that gave rise to the legislative machine that the single market then triggered a massive liberalization in all parts of the financial sector, of which we continue to live today in Europe. But the Capital Markets Union was also a UK-inspired project, one in which I know many of my colleagues in the city, both from the investment banking community and also lawyer community, were thinking that a big opportunity was coming. And indeed, sometimes I draw when I explain to my students the banking union, I put like a house with 3 pillars. And when I put Capital Markets Union, I draw an octopus, because a Capital Markets Union has many legs. So some of those legs are securitization, prospectus, listing, mutual funds, green finance, green bonds, pension fund reform, you name it. It's such a heterogeneous group of things. But in a nutshell, what it is to diversify the sources of funding away from banks. We still have dangerous bank-dominated system. And even if banks these days do a little bit of everything, in my opinion, is a major concern. Banks are always very fragile creatures. Even the big ones, look at Credit Suisse. So we should not be complacent. Here I'm putting as a Spanish citizen, my European hat. As a UK citizen, I think this is done better in the UK. Incidentally, I think the shambolic lack of a financial services agreement between the EU and the UK is something that needs to be remedied in the near future. And if any of us at the table online and in person can contribute to that, we should. It is in the interest of the EU and the UK that sooner rather than later, we have a proper agreement that governs financial relations between the 2 closest trading blocs historically, geographically, and in terms of business. So I am hopeful for that, and I want to believe that that is possible in the next few years, hopefully, with a change in political orientation that makes us realize that it is in the benefits as much of the EU as of the UK. But the future is, so I talk about the digital euro, the future is not only digital, and generative artificial intelligence will be a game changer. It's like we have these days this fight with our students in Queen Mary and other universities, the extent to which students rely on ChatGPT to do their exams, to the extent that this year I'm coming back to in-person handwritten examinations, because last year we had too many instances of plagiarism, use of ChatGPT. But it's a little bit like when we started using calculator in maths exams. These calculators are accepted. So we will need to come to terms with how to rely on generative AI. But the future in the EU is very committed, and even more than the UK, to have green, sustainable, and inclusive future. And the EU is very much putting the legislative machine rolling to make it happen. So besides the taxonomy regulation and sustainability, all the green bonds and things that Graham mentioned, let me just say a couple of things. On the one hand, the EU's efforts to become climate neutral enter the trial period on the 1st of October, so in this month, with a carbon border adjustment mechanism, or CBAM, sometimes also called carbon border adjustment mechanism. And this is, of course, part of the EU's effort to become carbon neutral. And though the purpose is to ensure that the goods manufactured in Europe and subject to the EU's emission trading systems, which sets a price on the carbon emitted, or able to withstand competition from products made in countries where polluting doesn't come with the same price attached, it is likely to continue to raise tensions with key trading partners. So the EU trading partners now have to report the greenhouse gas emissions tied to their exports of iron, steel, cement, aluminium, fertilizer, hydrogen, and electricity, quite a lot. And the point of the exercise, of course, is to shield the EU companies from unfair competition from the EU perspective, and to nudge other countries into setting their own price on carbon. So non-EU producers can deduct the cost of the carbon border adjustment mechanism if they have their own domestic carbon tax. Let me say just, and with this I will finish just very, very soon. I know I'm going beyond the 10 minutes, but so did Graham. So at least I'm taking the advantage that Graham did that. So I'm copying him. A few words about next generation. So the EU post-recovery plan, which is called Next Gen, which the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen hailed as the largest recovery project in Europe since the Marshall Plan. So very ambitious, 800 billion, tries to make Europe healthier, greener, more equal, more digital, all very nice words, with specific policies for the next generation. That's why it's called Next Generation EU, with this Recovery and Resilience Fund, and which is an instrument that provides grants and loans to support reform and investment in EU member states, a little bit like the inflation tax legislation in the EU, in the US. And there are actually growing calls to turn this facility into a permanent fiscal facility. So here I built on my argument before that we are far away still from a fiscal union, but we are approaching elements of quasi-fiscal union. So which concerns do I have? And with this, I promise I finish now my introductory extended remarks. My three biggest concerns or accountability always will always be, the EU benefited hugely from the UK when it comes to accountability. And I think without the UK, the EU tends to be very much top-down, tends to have a centralist instinct, something which I very much dislike, and something which I hugely appreciate in the Anglo-Saxon tradition of bottom-up and accountability. So that's a big concern for me. Second big concern is the aging of the population, which is counteracted by migration. The EU has a major challenge with migration, internal immigration and external migration, and will continue to have migration from Ukraine, Palestine, Syria, and Sahel, the vast semi-arid region of Africa that separates the Sahara Desert to the north and the tropical savannas to the south, where people in many countries, particularly in Southern Europe, are knocking on the door and creates massive tension. So with this, I have finished my extended introductory remarks. It's always a pleasure to contribute. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you. I'm sure that Graham and Rosa will have things to say about each other's presentations, but I'll ask you to hold. I'll call you at the end. What I'd like to do is bring in the audience now. Is anybody, I don't see any hands at the moment. Yes, at the back. Molly, could you introduce yourself?
I'm Molly Scott-Cato. I'm former MEP and Vice Chair of the European Movement. I'm going to say something slightly provocative as Vice Chair of the European Movement, if you'll excuse me, and that is that I was rather surprised to see you didn't have the UK on your slide of future EU members. And
2033.
You're guessing. I personally think, and this may also be provocative, that the UK is likely to be a member of the European Union before Ukraine is, so I thought I needed to see it on your slide there. And also, I wanted to question your assumption, which I think it was as strong as an assumption that we would have to join the euro in order to rejoin the European Union, because my conversations with European politicians suggest that isn't the case. I mean, formally that would be the case, but we can see that, you know, the European Union is a very flexible political entity, and I think particularly because of the finance sector, it actually is very important that the UK is a member, and I'm quite confident that we will be members before very long. We need 66% of people in this country to commit to that over 5 years. It's my sort of rule of thumb, and we're not far off that. Anyway, that's kind of a bit soapboxy, but I think the other point is important, which it will be a real advantage to the EU for us to be members, and perhaps particularly because of our financial sector. I agree with what Rosa said, that it's absurd that there isn't an arrangement there, but it's also sort of anomalous to have to have Europe's biggest financial centre not a part of the European Union, and I think there would be slack cut to enable us to promise to join the euro, but never actually do that. So I'd be quite interested to hear your views on that.
Yes, thank you. Do I see anybody else? Are we overwhelmed by the expertise we've been exposed to, John?
I'm just going to ask Graham and Professor Lastra what they thought about the deadline in 2025 for moving euro clearing from London, and what significance that would have for the status of the City of London as a centre for euro-denominated transactions.
I'll just take one or two more questions before we take replies. One at the back here. Sorry, I've got you running about.
Yes, hello, Tim Helm. I'll wear the European Movement hat as well then. I just wanted to ask the two panelists about commenting on Enrico Letta and the recently appointed high-level working group that's been appointed by the Belgian and Spanish presidencies, looking at the future direction of the single market. So I was in Brussels last week, and there seems to be an indication of some of the people working on that there's an interest in seeing how perhaps Britain could become more involved. So I wondered if you have any comments on that.
And then Brendan has a question. We have a microphone here.
Yeah, brief question for Professor Lastra. Thank you very much, Rosa, for joining us. You mentioned quasi-fiscal union. Could you give us a few more details about how you see that as working out, and how would it relate to accountability in political and public terms?
Thanks. Now, I know there's a lot more hands, but I think that's probably enough questions to come back to Graham and Rosa. Rosa, would you like to go first?
Okay, I will. I'll try to take the questions in the order that they were posed. So with regard to the UK becoming again a member of the EU, I am very sympathetic to that. I wish it could happen. I just don't think it's going to happen in the near future. However, there will be ways of achieving a better relationship, a better trade agreement, and perhaps a Norway type of agreement in the near or medium-term future. At the moment, the EU says that as Graham was saying, that any member state that aspires to join will not have the privileges that the UK had when it decided to exit. So any new member state and the UK, in principle, will not receive favorable treatment. If you're going to join the EU, you have to join the euro, or you have to meet the conditions and he outlined the conditions to eventually meet the euro. Having said that, rightly, as it was said in the third or last comment, the EU has shown great flexibility throughout its history to adjust and evolve. And so there is perhaps an opportunity in future to unpack some of the commitments. This, of course, will require a treaty change. And I say that any treaty change requires, a Pandora's box. I also thought that sometimes with the transitional periods and those things, the freedom of movement is something of people, not the other three freedoms of goods, services, and capital. They were straightforward. They were part of the single market. Sometimes I have found the EU position too radical there. I often thought, why can't we unpack, at least on some form of having some associate membership or some agreement? But again, it's perhaps been too long in the Anglo-Saxon world to think that these flexible arrangements should be possible. So, but as things stand at the moment, the only chance for the UK to rejoin the EU is to also accept that it has to join the euro. That may change in future. A very different thing is to get a comprehensive, not what we have at the moment, a comprehensive trade and financial services agreement that will improve the current situation. And that, of course, goes also to the second question. To what extent is in the interest of the Union, which sees itself as a bloc against the rest of the world, to have a strong financial center based outside the jurisdiction of the EU? So that's not, that's something that I'm not saying it will not happen, and it may happen, but the EU has been positioning itself with the different financial centers, emerging, none of them as strong as London, in Frankfurt, Amsterdam, also Paris, other countries in Italy, Spain. They all want to play a part in what used to be the vacuum left from the UK. I still hope and wish that the UK can reach a good agreement in future. And that, this focus that the Brexit campaign had on fisheries shows what fisheries is today, a negligible part when it comes to the size of the UK economy, if you compare to financial services or trade in so many other areas. So again, that was a UK obsession, which I actually failed to understand completely. Why it played such an outsized role? Perhaps it's because of the importance that the sea has always had in the country and the importance that the empire had in the past. To the very good question of quasi-fiscal union, I am just playing with the thought that, again, one shouldn't be dealing with sometimes Hegelian categories of things, just to have, there are a step-by-step approach. I mean, the success of the EU has been the step-by-step approach. We have used deadlines in order to build a step-by-step approach. The first stage of EMU, a second stage of EMU, a third stage of EMU. And this staggered approach has been very successful in building the union and going back to Schumann's declaration. So I see elements of a quasi-fiscal union in the potential for issuing debt, green bonds, making the next gen a permanent fiscal facility. So you start building that. Of course, any changes in this area need to also look at the very difficult relationship between a centralized monetary policy and a decentralized fiscal policy, in which a quasi-fiscal union, as you rightly identify, does not have for the time being a proper euro treasury, does not have an institutional counterpart. So advancing in that direction raises very valid and serious accountability and legitimacy concerns. But I want to continue that we can build with flexibility and accountability of elements of that, and hopefully we will get there.
Thank you. Great.
Yes, can I roll together John's question and that of Molly? We'll be a member of the EU before Ukraine is a member. We may well be, but I don't rule it out. But the question of the Euro membership is going to be a critical question. I think that it's pretty well hard baked into the various treaty texts that you have to be a member of the Euro. You have to join Euro. You have to set out to do that. You may fail, as I listed the failures of a number of countries to achieve it, but you have got to set out to do it. Sweden is obviously the classic. They don't have an opt-out, whatever they say. So then comes the question of, do they really want to have us in the Euro or in the EU without being part of the Euro? We have a current account deficit, and I know I'm terribly old-fashioned in talking about these sort of things, but it adds up over the decades. We run a current account deficit of around about 4% per annum of GDP per annum. We have had the worst performance in the OECD area for at least a decade. I'm just trying to visualize the chart. It's at least a decade. So we have built up an enormous debt to the foreigners. I'm sure everyone remembers Mark Carney's comment about be careful of relying on the kindness of strangers. If something goes wrong in the UK, we have foreign exchange reserves which will be wiped out in the moment. So we have to go to somebody cap in hand for help, or we have to adjust our economic policy. Keep in mind that our exports are about half, exports of goods are about half our imports of goods. This is not a small adjustment. The balance is made up largely by services. And of course, the financial services sector is the big number. Now, I am very concerned about the erosion of the city's competitiveness because of Brexit. The indicators are there, and I published a report a little while ago, which actually the Federal Trust report is on the website there as well as my own, going through these bit by bit. And nobody has come back to me and said, you're wrong on these. On the contrary, a number of well-placed people have come back and said, we agree. So we're now looking at this, the erosion of the city's financial dominance. And to take John's question of the clearing, the euro clearing of derivatives, again in my report and some evidence I sent into the House of Lords a year or so ago, the riskiness of our exposure to euro-denominated derivatives is enormous. It's 40-something times our GDP in the nominal amount. It's huge. Now, in my view, they would be mad to allow a third country to have the financial future, the financial stability of Europe in its hands, particularly when it has shown the willingness to elect someone like Boris Johnson, who won't abide by treaties he's signed. So if you're in the situation of a CCP, it shouldn't go bust, but if it is going bust, and 90% of their derivatives trades are cleared here, how will they enforce their will on the Bank of England? They can't. And this is the real core why they want to see over a period derivative clearing, which is hugely risky, should never have been allowed to happen in the first place. That's of course has long since profit, but there it is. They should move it steadily into the European jurisdiction. Now they're trying to do that on a small scale. The 2025 deadline is to have, I forget the phrase, a minimum account size for clients, for fund managers in the euro area. It's not the whole. And how much is this minimum is debatable. Is it 10%? Is it a bit more? But we should be very clear that the final driver, and this is one of the things I need to check out with my friends, the final driver in all these things is what the investment banks who are doing the actual trades and striking the derivative transaction to hedge their positions, what are they doing? And if you look at the trading pattern of the derivative, well, not derivatives, but of the banks who are doing the bond trading, there are a handful, half a dozen, of which maybe HSBC and Barclays come into that category. Is HSBC a British bank? Question. Maybe regulated here, but it's another question. But all the others are continental or American. Now, they are being pressured by the ECB to move their risks, their risk management, into the jurisdiction of the ECB. That's Frankfurt or Paris or Amsterdam, wherever. They're being pressured, and they will gradually do it over a period. And when they've done that, will they then be allowed to run enormous risks in positions outside the EU? Remember, the equity trading went from, in European shares, went from London to Amsterdam overnight because of the rules. Will those rules get tweaked once they are sure that the EU derivatives clearing system can cope with the transactions? Yes, I said about the current account and the risk of it. To correct that would require a huge devaluation. So if we're in the single market and not in the euro, we could suddenly give ourselves a very large competitive advantage by having a large devaluation. Just the thing which is why the euro was invented in the first place. Now, just to take up finally Tim's comment about the letter, the report on the single market. There are a number of Italians who have a great deal more economic distinction. Mario Draghi would come to mind. Mario Monti would be another one who comes to mind. Enrico Letta was, as I recall, pretty much of a damp squib as the Prime Minister of Italy. So why he's going to be such a font of wisdom on the single market, I don't know. I'm not holding my breath to read it.
Thanks very much. Now, I know there were other hands up, and I'm hoping to get another round of questions in. With your agreement, I'll take away some of your lunchtime.
Not too much.
Not very much, but could I ask both questioners and responders to be very brief, please, because you're keeping people from their lunch. So, I saw some hands up over here. Yes, this gentleman.
Just 2 points very quickly. I wrote a book and published it stating how it would be possible for a country to go and leave the euro without leaving the European Union, and how precisely that could be done on a consensual basis. So there has been some academic work that's been done on that. Secondly, with regard to membership of the UK rejoining the EU but not joining the euro, you are absolutely correct that the Treaty of Maastricht, as amended, does state that. On the other hand, Sweden has avoided it by deciding unilaterally that it is a condition to join the euro to be part of the ERM2, and that it is simply a voluntary decision of the Swedish people not to go and join the ERM2. That shows that things can be fixed. Now, clearly, if the Commission or the European Central Bank thought that that was an abusive position, and many academics have taken that position, they could have been taken to the court, but nobody has taken Sweden to the court over that point.
Thank you. Did I see? I'm sure there were a lot more hands. Perhaps you're waiting for your lunch. Yes. Well, let's have 2 quick responses to that, Graham.
Yes, I didn't say that you would actually have to leave the European Union in order to leave the euro. That certainly follows. Only EU members can be a member of the euro. But the logical consequences and the reason for this, I made the point about notes and coins, etc. I know this sounds terribly technical, but the moment a country looks as though it may leave the euro, anyone who has a deposit in a bank in that country, they've got the slightest degree of sense. Most of them have, and in the modern technological world, as FCB in California showed moments later, the deposit base is gone, which we're all waking up to. They will move their deposits out of that bank, and that bank will be comprehensively destroyed overnight.
The solution to that, of course, is the government that decides to do it will plan in secret and introduce capital controls to prevent that.
In the old days, you could post policemen on the Alpine passes and stop chaps with bags of gold coins running across. But I'm afraid in the world of the internet, it's not profitable.
Okay. Rosa.
Yeah, just to add on Sweden, it is true, Sweden lives in a legal limbo. But, when the euro was adopted, Sweden did a referendum and the people did not want to adopt the euro. So it lives on a legal limbo. But that was, before the treaty very clearly states that for any of the new member states in the accession treaties, any of the new member states, we could change that, but that's what the treaty says at the moment. Any member state that aspires to join the EU has also to join the euro. What happens in the past is in the past. What happens in the future? I'm not saying we couldn't change it, but that's the law at the moment. That's what the treaty says. And then Sweden exploited kind of legal limbo and lives in that legal limbo. The UK managed to get an exception. That's why I think it's so sad that the UK left, because any re-entry into the EU is unlikely to be on as favorable terms as the UK had when it was a favorably treated member of the EU. So this is just how it is. As I said, things can change in future, and the EU has constantly changed. So I'm not saying that it will not change in future, but according to the law, that's the reality at present. It's the only choice that exists according to the law at this time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And surprisingly, we're going to finish on time. Could you join me, please, in thanking Graham and Rosa?